Welcome to the Write the Docs podcast, number 19. We are legally able to vote, I think, in most countries, and a few other things in other places. But anyway, let's not go down those paths before we wander into dangerous territory. Let's start in the future. We're one short today, but we still have someone from the same time zone as one of our co-hosts, so not too bad. Let's start in the future. Jared, how are you doing? And maybe you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hello. Yes, well, I'm doing okay. I might be a bit croaky today because I've got what seems to be a bit of a chest infection that I'm getting over at the moment. So excuse any splutters and coughs. But apart from that, yes, very good. I've been dabbling since we last spoke in a bit of email marketing copy of all things. And yeah, I agree. It's sort of like you have to turn your technical writing brain on its head to do it. It's good practice though, because it makes you write really concisely and also focus on the value to the customer, which is something that is a good skill to have. So it's been good, but geez, it's been hard to get your head around it.
Okay, let's go back in time and over to I guess you're in San Francisco. I don't know. You can introduce yourself, our guest for the show, and we'll go into a bit more detail about you in the very near future, but maybe just introduce yourself briefly.
Sure. I'm Jessica Parsons. If you're in the Write the Doc Slack, you may know me as Very Thorough. And I do live in the San Francisco area, not quite in San Francisco, and work for a company called Nullify, which we can chat about later.
Sorry. Yep.
No.
Sorry. You will have to put up with Jared and I saying thorough all the time. Sorry.
Yes. I know. Well, honestly, actually, that's how it's supposed to be pronounced because it's a reference to The Big Lebowski. And there's a character in that talks about a doctor who's very thorough, and she says thorough. And it started as a gaming username based on that, but then it occurred to me that it actually was pretty accurate. So to a fault.
I've actually just finished. I'm on the last chapter of the Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, and the writer is British, and so wonderfully British. It's quite fun. And I am Chris in Berlin. It's cold, and dark, and miserable. It's that time of year. I know this is going to probably really upset Jared because I know Australia is going through a heat wave right now.
Yes, we literally, not figuratively, literally have not had the air conditioning off for 3 weeks.
I think I've had the heating off in 3 weeks. So.
Yeah, well, I think in some ways heating is something more important because if you don't have it on, your pipes freeze. So, you kind of have to. But air conditioning is one of those optional things that just makes life a little bit more bearable. I'm
pretty sure the places that have air conditioning in Berlin I can count on one hand. So, no, not because of the heat. It actually gets hot in summer. It's just I don't know. They just don't like it here. So,
yeah, there's not as much around here either because it doesn't get as hot most of the time in the San Francisco area, and then on the flip side, we don't have insulation in our houses either.
Yeah. So my wife and I were in Athens for a couple of weeks, escaping the cold winter for a little bit. And when you suddenly get back to German houses and you realize, oh my God, I can't hear anybody next door.
Yeah.
Wow, it's so quiet. So anyway, enough of building standards around the world. Before we get into Netlify, we actually were just chatting a little bit before we started recording about this is interesting because we're all meetup organizers on this call. So we all have different experiences. But I think, Jessica, you have one that's definitely different from Jared and I, in that you help organize, one of the meetups in your area. And you were saying that it's split into 3. So yeah, how's the meetup gone? I'm guessing it's a fairly busy area. We would hope for tech writing. And how's your experience been and why did it split?
Well, it is a relatively busy area and we have a pretty big meetup, but it's also one that has a lot of competition for meetups too. Not so much in the tech writer sphere. I mean, we have like 3 different STC Society for Technical Communication. I'm not sure if that's outside of the US as well. So I thought, oh, maybe I should actually say
here
what that
it's
is.
TechCom in Europe.
In Australia, it's sort of it is, but it sort of isn't. We don't really have a lot of representation from STC here in Australia.
Yeah, so there's 3 of those, and then there's the Write the Docs meetup, and then there's just like a whole host of other meetups related to development and things like that. But we also are fairly geographically spread out, and so there are people who would love to attend the San Francisco meetups, but live quite some distance away in San Jose, or they're out in the East Bay or something like that. And we started to find that people wanted to have some meetups closer to home, and there were people who were willing to help organize with that. So now it's still all under the same meetup group. So you see the events for all 3, but we have a San Francisco, we have East Bay, and we have a South Bay / Peninsula, which for people who live in San Francisco, anything south of San Francisco is South Bay, but if you live in between, it's not.
Right. Because it's a pretty sprawling city, isn't it?
What's the East Bay?
So Oakland.
Okay.
So if you cross over the Bay Bridge to the east, Oakland and Berkeley and I don't know, lots of other cities you probably never heard of.
Do you rotate speakers around them, or is it all somewhat completely separate?
Sometimes. So, I mean, there are people who go to multiple ones too. And like for me, I help organize the South Bay one because I live down this direction. But I work in San Francisco, so I go to the San Francisco ones too. Usually don't make it over to the East Bay ones because traffic from where I am to over there in the evenings is not practical. But yeah, so something we haven't done too much of yet, but I think we will, because we've only been doing this for a little under a year, is doing some of that rotating speakers, because there are plenty of people who, didn't get a chance to see this speaker in Oakland, but would like to see them in San Jose. So that's kind of something to take advantage of. But something we've been trying to figure out is the cadence of it, because initially we were doing 3-month meetups every month, which was a lot. And we all sort of said, it's going to be too much. And then we thought, okay, well, if we alternate like every other month, and now what we're into now is San Francisco does even numbered months, and South Bay and East Bay both do a meetup in the odd numbered months.
I have never ever heard anyone refer to months like that, but it makes tremendous sense.
Yeah, I know, I didn't either. I was just saying every other month, and then saying and then the other ones that aren't the every other month, like. Then I was like, wait a minute, we could just do odd and even numbers, and it totally makes sense.
I help run a meetup here in our co-working space, and that's always a point of confusion. And now I've just got a great way to clear it up. So yeah. Okay, cool. All right. All right, and we will, just whilst we're on, we'll probably remind people again at the end of the show, but I mean, I'm sure by Jared and I's standards, possibly not by Jessica's standards, close by to San Francisco. Write the Docs Portland is happening in May. And the call for papers is this will probably
Wednesday.
Go out. This will be going out on the 28th. So on Wednesday. Depending what country you're in.
Yeah. Okay. On the 31st is the deadline.
Yeah, and I'm quite glad because I hadn't finished mine in time for the old deadline, which is
Me either.
So you still got time to get something in if you haven't already. And I think I'm going to be there, whether accepted or not. I think.
Me too.
Not sure. Yeah. Jared.
No, unfortunately, I'm not because
it's a long trip.
It's a long trip, yeah, it is. And I think this year I'm probably going to help out again with Write the Docs Australia in some capacity.
Yeah.
That's actually interesting at the moment. We're trying to work out where we actually have it this year.
Yeah.
Melbourne's had it the last couple of years, and we Swapnil did a poll recently to gauge interest about where it would be held, and there wasn't really a lot of response from Sydney, yet there was from Brisbane and Melbourne. So we might consider doing it up in Brisbane if there's enough interest up here. But from a logistical perspective, and if Swapnil is organising it, of course, that makes it a little bit more difficult for him to lead that. So he'd be depending a lot more on people on the ground like Russell and me and all the other documentarians up here in Brisbane to make that happen. So, yeah.
Well, right. I have to say I really enjoyed the one last year. So I have to say last year now.
Yeah.
Because it actually officially is last year. Yeah, that was great to have you down. Your session on the sort of like the background behind static site generators, even as a user of static site generators in the past, was good because what you pointed out was the fact that they're just doing the same thing that things were doing 10 years ago, but slightly in a different order. So it was really interesting to get that insight. It was good.
And we have a couple of potential questions around that theme, which maybe we'll get to. We'll see. Let's press on, because actually this is, I mean, I think this is one of those interesting ones where I've certainly had a lot to do with Netlify for various reasons. And it sounds like... and also the underpinnings, things like static site generators, and I think you have too, Jared. So I think it's one of those interviewees where we have probably a lot we want to talk about. So let's stop the small talk and let's get into it. All right.
Yeah. Let's do
it. So before we do, though, just a tiny bit more, because one of the questions that you added into our doc, Jessica, was around teaching experience informs your current work. So unless I've completely misunderstood that, I'm assuming that your background is a teaching background or not?
Yeah.
Maybe just correct.
Okay. Yeah, I went to school for education. I got my master's in math education and a credential, and I taught actually elementary school. And then also worked as a technology coordinator for a school, which basically meant that I did tech support for like anything that plugged into a wall, and also taught programming classes and worked with teachers to integrate technology into their classrooms. And so... yeah, my first profession was teaching. And then I started doing web development stuff on the side and started doing that more. So I did professional web development freelance for like 10 years. And then a couple of years ago, decided to mix those two things together and teach people web development and write documentation for people around web development tools. So.
And was that a straight jump into the Netlify job, or was there a kind of a bridge of something in the middle there?
Yeah, I did teach, well, a couple of things. First, I teach, and I continue to do this, teach short form workshops for an organization called Girl Develop It, which is here in the States. It's, despite the name, for adult women and non-binary individuals to learn to code. And so I teach some workshops for that, but also taught briefly for a nonprofit code school. So it's for a nonprofit organization that does a variety of job training, from like culinary to construction, and then also web development. And it reminded me why I quit full-time teaching in the first place.
It's training, isn't it?
It's not a good fit for my set of skills and preferences, put it that way. So
cool. And I could certainly see, because you alluded to that it informs your current work, and I can kind of personally see why that might be, but maybe explain why you feel that does help.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there are certain things that just, it's something that I didn't really think about actually until I came into a field where I'm working with people who are explaining things, many of them explaining that things isn't their full-time job. They're developers who are explaining their code to somebody. But even ones who aren't, that something that I didn't really think of as being a specialized piece of knowledge or area of knowledge actually is that knowing things about scaffolding and the idea of like setting things up so that someone's getting into like the jargon of it, the zone of proximal development, and like making things that aren't too hard but not too easy so that they're actually learning more as they go. And also thinking things about like labeling the behavior and not the person. So that was something that fit more with my classroom management kinds of things, that and that fits not just with things about people's personal activities, but also like in documentation. For example, working with writing the docs for Nullify Cms, they say, oh, a CMS is for non-technical people to do this. And it's like, well, first off, you're really defining technical extremely specifically, because you're basically saying people who don't like to like work in Git in Markdown. And there are a lot of really technical things you could be doing and not be doing code. But also there's plenty of people who know how to write code who'd rather not write prose in a text editor, and who'd rather not have to think about these things. So thinking about defining that as not something that's for non-technical people, but for people who want to do these things. And so that kind of, I think, also came from some of that background. And,
okay. Jared, would you like to take the next one? Maybe we'll fill in the gaps and get some information on the company next.
Yeah, I think that's not a bad idea. So for those, unlike Chris and I, who maybe might be new to what Netlify is, and also the extension to Netlify being Netlify CMS, I wonder if we might be able to talk a bit more, first of all, about what Netlify actually does, and then go into how that fits in with the CMS strategy that you guys, you folks have there.
Yeah, so Nullify is basically an all-in-one platform for taking your code to deployment and hosting it on a CDN around the world, and doing lots of other cool things with it once it's out there. And specifically for docs, that becomes really useful for when you're handling docs' code, storing it in a repository, working with developers, managing it with Git. Then when you have your content stored in a Git repository, you can use continuous integration to build your site, probably using a static site generator or other build tool. And we can handle that. So you basically connect your repo to Netlify, tell us what the build command is, tell us where the content is going to be when the build command is done. And it's set up from that point. And then every time you make a push to your repository, it will trigger a new build and push that out all at once, not a little bit at a time, so you don't get like this weird partial state, out to our CDN around the world. So that's also closer to your users and not restricted to a single server in San Francisco. And additionally, it adds some other kind of nice features along that. The one I like very much is deploy previews. So if you make a pull request on your repository, it'll automatically build a preview of what the site will look like if that pull request is merged, which is handy internally and also for open source projects, because if someone submits a change to the docs and they don't want to, like, you find a typo and you fix it in the docs, you don't want to have to pull down and clone that whole repository for that project and then run it locally and make sure it all looks okay. You can just look at the preview and it gets linked in the pull request. And I've found that really useful in projects that I'm working on with that stuff. On the other end, there's lots of other fancy things you can do with it, like authentication and serverless functions, and
which we will certainly dig into. There's a couple of those there that are quite interesting. And do you know when the company was started and why? What were the founders? What itch were they trying to scratch?
Yeah, so well, the sort of first founder, which is Matt Billman, he previously had worked in web development for agencies. He actually worked in Spain, and they were churning out websites for their agency. I think it was like hundreds a week. There's a lot. And he actually made a Rails-based CMS initially, and then started, that's like, it still exists. It's called WebPop. But then static site generators started coming along, and it was like, this seems like something that's pretty useful, and doing things with static sites. And they initially built something called BitBalloon, which some people might have heard of.
Sounds vaguely familiar. Yeah, I can't remember.
Yeah. It was a really simple site for drag and drop deploying things.
Yes.
So you could just drag a folder onto it and it would put up a site.
Yeah.
And that no longer exists as BitBalloon. We now finally moved it into Netlify, and it's just called Netlify Drop. and has all the same functionality. We just don't have to maintain a separate stack for Bitbullet anymore. But yeah, so it started along that, but that really wasn't as powerful as it could be. And so I moved into doing, adding the whole build process into that and moving into all the things that you can do within that ecosystem, and the idea of what they ended up terming the Jamstack, which I'm kind of like going in different directions here, but because it really felt like to him and to others that's really where the web is going, and breaking that out. And the idea of the Jamstack, I should explain that. It stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And it's not about specific technologies, but about the idea of splitting your front end from your back end, and pre-building as much of the markup as you can, so that when people go to visit your site, they don't have to go and make a trip to the server and have the server build the page and then bring it back to you. And that makes for a more efficient development process, and then also for a more efficient user experience. And so kind of thinking about that being the way of making sites of the future, he basically built a company around it. And he met up with and convinced his best friend from school, also in Denmark, they're both from Denmark, to come out to the US and help him start this new company. And that was, at this point, I think about 3.5 years ago. And it's been going from there. I met them at a local meetup a couple of years ago, and by learning about the Nullify CMS that they were making, and ended up working with them after that. So
that's why it's important to go to meetups, right?
Yes, indeed. They are very handy.
Yeah.
Networking. People ask you why you do it. It's like, well,
because I like to work. Because I actually like to get jobs. Yeah.
Well, actually, before, no, I think it was when we were on the call. My memory is fading already. Jared, you were mentioning that at Write the Docs Australia last year, Jessica spoke about static site generators and choosing one. So, care, do the two of you, in your collective memories, care to share what a static site generator is and how you choose one, I guess?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Oh, and I should actually point out, because I was watching the last podcast and you were talking about the Write the Docs Australia.
You kind of made that one up on the spot, so don't.
Yeah.
But my workshop was at one point, Jared, you called it a vendor presentation, and I wanted to clarify that I did apply to the CFP and get accepted before we talked anything about sponsorship. So it was not a. I'm
glad to be corrected on that thing. Because it's hard to tell sometimes, because all the conferences are, the great thing about the conferences are that we're usually very transparent about how everyone gets there. And I know that it was actually really good to have all the sponsors from last year's Write the Docs Australia, because I don't personally see that there's a problem with a sponsor talking about something, as long as it's not, sometimes we've all seen them, the presentations that go and try and sell you on something. But even, not that yours was, but even if it did take that form, it actually didn't come across like that anyhow. It was actually really informative, and it focused less on the product and more about what the static site generators are, and also trying to get through the minefield of trying to pick one, because that's a real challenge, isn't it? There's so many out there. Like StaticGen, I think now has about staticgen.org.
I always forget to. I think staticgen.com.
It's got over about 500 different types of static site generators now.
Yeah.
So where do you even start? Like, how do you do it? If you're new to static site generators, how do you start picking one?
Yeah.
And I'd actually really like to go back a step before you do that.
What are they?
What are they?
Yeah.
Yeah, what are they?
Yeah. And the teacher in me is going, okay, let's first introduce our terms. So yeah, and I'm not going to go into the whole history of static site generator and how we got there, but the concept of a static site generator is that it takes, rather than you having to make every single HTML page in your site, it uses a system of templates and a system of content files, which are usually written in Markdown, but sometimes with other markup languages like RST or ASCII doc, and other fields that you would put into that file, which they usually call front matter. So it's taking these content files and it's taking these templates and it puts them together to build the pages of your site. And traditional monolithic sites, so things like might be a Ruby on Rails app, or it might be a WordPress site, those ones actually work with the same system, but they build it on the fly. So when a person goes to visit a site, it'll go to the server and say, give me this page, and it'll say, okay, first I got to get this template, and I'm going to get this content, I'm going to put those together, here's your page. And static site generators move that process to before, at the time that the site changes. So when you make changes to your site, it triggers a build, and it generates your static site, puts all the, it goes through and says, okay, I've got all this content, it works with all of these templates, I'm going to build all of these HTML pages. And then it just basically gives you a folder full of HTML and CSS and JavaScript that you can serve up onto a server, a file server on the web. And there's no access to running server-side calls. It's much more secure, it's much quicker usually, and more easily scalable.
Yep. And as someone who used to work at the CMS land and spent many a nightmare configuring Apache and Nginx and caching levels and all sorts of nonsense.
Yeah, and it's much easier to work on locally, and yeah, there are a lot of things that get simpler about it, I think. And your content is stored in files that anybody can access, and version control as opposed to inside of a database.
So, I mean, this is the interesting thing, I think, because in theory, that in principle, that sounds quite a simple idea. So why are there so many?
Yeah, how can there be 400 different ways to do the same thing?
And why do I pick one when it seems like, why do I need how many hundred things to do this fairly simple process? Like, what are the different paradigms, the different justifications, the different raisons d'etre, whatever we want to call them, for a lot of these projects?
Yeah, and I mean, the vast majority of people are using the most popular, like 10 different ones. They're, you know, the ones that are down, even if you get past like 50, there aren't that many people using each one of those, or they're very, very niche. And so I think one of the things that is one of my primary ones, in particular for docs, so thinking about static site generators for docs, because you might have different reasoning for other purposes, is that one of the reasons that we often do docs as code is because that's where the developers are. And so, you know, if you're working to get more developer participation and want to make sure that your docs match up with the code as it changes, you want to be working in their tools and their space. So if they're working in Git, you've got your stuff managed in Git as well. And with that in mind, I think the choice of your static site generator can also be structured around who's doing the development. I think regardless of the features, that can be one of the first ones to think about, is like whoever's developing that site, and that might be you. Whatever language or system that it's built in is probably going to be a shorter learning curve or less friction if you're using that language. So, you know, if you are at a Ruby shop, Jekyll is a really good common one to use. If you're using Python, like, no one's going to even question using Sphinx for that. So I think that is one of the things that I think kind of comes in, and there's a variety of really JavaScript based ones. So if you're working with front enders who are doing a lot of JavaScript, they'll feel very often more familiar working with a JavaScript based one. So that I think is one of the first things that I think about, because most of them can do a lot of the different things. But at the same time, we're actually going through a docs reorganization now for our own docs, and we're planning to build a whole new doc site. And so we get to choose what static site generator we're going to use. And it's been kind of tough, and we're going through and evaluating some of the different things. We're probably not going, like Jekyll actually isn't even on our list, although I think that is a very valid choice. There's a lot of people who use it. And we do actually have a lot of Ruby users in our organization, but it's got some slower build times and things like that. One that I think is very commonly used and has some advantages is Hugo. One of the things that people really point out with Hugo, it's made with Go and it builds really quickly. And the key with that is that if you are doing local development and working on something and you make a change and you want to see what the change is, generators that build really slowly can be a bit maddening because you make a change and then you have to go and get a cup of coffee and come back and see if it built and see what it looks like. And Hugo builds quickly, and so it goes through.
Yeah.
But one of the downsides to it, I think, though, is that the templating language is odd. It uses kind of a Polish calculator functional style of making templates. So where I know, I had never heard. Look it up, Polish calculator. It's actually kind of an interesting thing. It was invented by someone who's Polish, and it's basically you say the function you're going to do and then the arguments. So you'll say like instead of 5 + 4, you'll say +5 4. And that's the way that Go's templating language works too. So instead of saying if this is equal to this, which makes sense in English and lots of templating languages do, Hugo, which uses Go's templating, says EQ, which is a function that stands for equals, and then it'll have this and that. And so it just feels very different, and it's not as intuitive to read. So it's got, I think, slightly steeper learning curve on that. But once you get past that syntax, it's not too hard to look through a template and say like, okay, here's the HTML, here's the part where it's generating some things, and here's the part, here's some more HTML. Whereas, and I'm gonna start branching off in different directions, Gatsby is another really popular one that's really jumping up in popularity right now. But one thing I find interesting about Gatsby is it's written with React, which is a JavaScript library, which is extremely popular right now. So if you're working with developers who are working in React, they'll usually feel pretty comfortable working in Gatsby, and that's good. Or if they're working, with React in any way. But if you're not in that JavaScript ecosystem and you're not working with React, it can be, I think, a little harder to parse out those templates. And I see Chris, you're not.
Yeah, I really loved. I saw a lot of talks on it, and I really wanted to try it. And over Christmas, I tried to redevelop one of my sites in it, and I just got so utterly lost. And actually, this is not common, a problem unique to static site generators, but I especially found it with Gatsby. Was that it has this concept of data sources. And actually, I realized after some digging that Jekyll does this to a minor extent. It's not unique to Gatsby.
Yeah, Hugo will support it too.
Yeah. And I had some, I think, probably esoteric content sources. And the plugins that were available, again, often they would give you a very rudimentary example of how to get started, and then you would try to take it further, and you just got stuck. So I got so stuck with trying to import content sources, I ended up going back to Jekyll. And I must admit, the build times never bother me that much, but even my personal site, because it's my blog, it aggregates all my blog posts, and my blog posts go back over 10 years. It does take a while, actually. Yeah, I really want to try it again, but and I met the Gatsby team, and they're all very lovely, and I just couldn't get my head around it.
I agree. Like I find when I'm kind of introducing them too, I feel like a lot of the ones like Jekyll and Hugo and Sphinx and other ones with, I guess you could say, not JavaScript-based templating languages, you can go to a piece of content and it'll have in the front matter to say, oh, the layout for this is default. Okay, so let's see if I can find what the default layout is. And you go into your folder and you find, oh, here's under layouts default.html. Okay, and then you can look into that and you can see like, oh, here's some content. And this part says I'm going to draw from this. And you can kind of dig down deeper and deeper and find where stuff is made and how it's built. And I find that in many of the JavaScript ones like Gatsby, it can be harder to go through that process. It's kind of buried in this weird code sometimes that doesn't look like HTML. And
I still find the way, this is getting a bit technical here, so we'll stop there. But I don't know, I got bored up around this separation of concerns in development. And I find the way that it's a React problem of mixing them together. Just I don't like.
Yeah. You got your CSS and your JavaScript and your HTML all just smushed together in one big component. And
anyway, we're gonna get Jared. What static site generators do you use? Have you tried? You like? You don't like?
Yeah. Well, I've sort of over the years I've tried lots of different types of static site generators. I think I started with Jekyll. With one of these really cool yeah, I think everyone does. It's like the gateway drug for static site generators, right? So you start with Jekyll, and then you go and try other things. But the thing that I went from Jekyll to these what I call fork and run style things that you can go to GitHub, do a search for a blog. If you want to just get started with static sites, and what you can do is fork the repo, make a couple of configuration changes, and then with just a couple of changes, you've got an up and running site. So I think they were sort of like the precursors to services like Netlify that allow you to just deploy a site very quickly. And they were great because a lot of the problem with I think getting started with static site generators is they're generally made for developers by developers. If you look at the technical aspects of them. So if you're not really comfortable with front end stuff, and you're not really comfortable with a lot of if you're new to Git, for example, it can be quite daunting. So this takes some of the rough edges off getting started, at least with it. So then at least if you have something set up, you have something to play with, and like you say, you can go and explore the file structure and learn about how things hang together. Now I think you were talking about the task that Netlify has at the moment to redesign and redo the tooling. Well, we're in a similar position. When I started the company that I'm working at now, CreditSense, we have a similar problem. We've got two websites that are essentially the same brand, but they're marketed as different products. So we're going to need to look at ways to fix that up. But there's also the docs problem. At the moment, we're using Confluence with an internal server, and we've got an external server which we're using Kamala workflows to publish to. And it works well enough, but it still looks very Confluence-y. So, and with all the problems that attracts with Confluence's tiered pricing model, and I won't go into details, but it makes it tricky to make it look anything different than Confluence, and tricky to sort of make the content architecture work the way you want. So as part of my job when I first started with the company, we went down the process of, well, what do we do? Like, what do we move to a Docs as code model? Do we look at static site generators? And I said, being a technical writer, well, of course you do, because you don't want to be using something like Confluence to serve your docs. I mean, there are advantages. Everyone knows how to use it, but at the same time, it's very inflexible once you start getting past the core things that it offers. So yes, let's look at static site generators. So off I went, and I immediately discounted Jekyll. Sorry,
why?
Jekyll. Well, number one, we're not a Ruby shop, and this goes back to a really good point you made about picking the technology out of the 500 different types that you have. You make a really good point about going, what technology are we using in house? Because they all kind of do the same thing, the static site generators, but getting that buy-in from your development team with the tooling that they're familiar with and that they're happy to support will mean that you'll be able to have a much better experience as a writer, because you're not going to have to be doing on the tools a lot compared to actually doing the writing, because you're going to have people there that can actually help you make things work the way you want. And that's a big challenge that you have to consider when you're actually shortlisting these static site generators, as I found. So I actually went down the path originally of looking at Go and Hugo, and I thought, because it was, we also have a mixture of development technologies in the building as well, and some people have experience with Go, and there's also, but mostly CreditSense is a Node.js shop. So as you could probably imagine, we started drifting down the path of Gatsby.js, because it is basically a Node app. And it sort of made sense in the long run to do that. we actually had someone do a prototype with Gatsby and another complementary tool called Strapi. And Strapi is an API. So without going too technical, as we tend to sometimes drift into, being documentarians, Strapi uses a thing called GraphQL. Gatsby and Strapi use a technology called GraphQL, and it's that strange layer that Chris was having a bit of trouble working out, because it is unusual in the way it works. You're essentially accessing an API to load your doc site, and that was just a mind trick for me when I was looking at it, because it's like, well, hang on, I'm so used to just loading a markdown file into a static site generator, and it's simple.
Yeah. Although in some ways that's not really different from like a WordPress site. I mean, it's usually all on the same server. It's not separated out into an API, but it is accessing your docs somewhere in a database. So.
Yeah, it's absolutely right, and it is true. I think in a lot of ways, Gatsby is kind of a good transitional static site generator for people who are used to the WordPress model, because
absolutely.
And this was some of my issues with it, because it felt like I was just programming a CMS again.
You're right. It sort of it does a little bit feel like that. So it's interesting. But we did a proof of concept with it, and we got it pulling. Strapi lets you basically roll your own API, and it does it in a graphical user interface. So you're essentially it's like a drag and drop API builder. It's really quite a powerful tool. It's made by 3 dudes in France, basically, and they're really responsive to any requests. And like we sort of started, I think we did a couple of pull requests as part of the proof of concept we were doing to help them out. But it's pretty amazing. Like, you can build your own API. It actually has a graphical user interface that people can use to put it in docs. So write the docs in a graphical user interface, and then when it saves it, it will actually make it available as part of the build chain into Gatsby. And it was surprisingly effective as a proof of concept. It got the nod, so we're probably going to be using it for our technology combination for static sites. But then the hard bit comes, right? You have to develop it, and you have to support it inside, and that's where it becomes interesting. And I think, I don't know, Chris, if you agree with this, but this might actually lead into Netlify CMS and some of the problems it actually solves with this side of the equation. So maybe we'll talk about that.
I was thinking about it too, because Strapi is one that like Nullify CMS, is a headless CMS, which is sort of our concept of editing content for these static site generators. It's separated out. And I feel like it kind of came out of nowhere not that long ago and just shot to the top. Like, if you go to headlesscms.org, and we're ranking it by stars, and Nullify CMS had gotten to the top of the open source headless CMSs. We'd passed up Pros, which had been holding strong for a long time. And then Strapi came along and just like went right past.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And it's interesting too. It handles the content in a database with an API. Netlify CMS, on the other hand, handles the content in a Git repository in your Markdown files. So in some ways, it doesn't depart as much from that basic model of managing your content in a Git repo. And that's kind of an interesting story about how I started working at Netlify, was that I was working with static site generators, and I really loved the potential that they had and things like that. But I was like, you know what they really need though is a CMS. And I was at a meetup talking to the founders of Netlify. You know what we really need? And they're like, as a matter of fact, we're making one. And that's how I got started, was writing docs for Netlify CMS there. And so what it does is you're managing your content in a Git repository anyway, and Netlify CMS makes a wrapper around that process. So instead of having to, edit a Markdown file and then make a commit and having even a GitHub user account, you don't have to have any of those things to edit a static site that has content in a Git repository with Netlify CMS. Instead, it happens to be a React app, but you set up configuration, and when you go in to edit a file, instead of going to the file and then you've got like a bunch of front matter that like, oh, do I capitalize this one or do I not? Does this one have underscores? You don't have to remember any of that because it basically translates that file into a UI. And then that UI says like, here's the date field. And you don't have to remember which format the date has to be. You just use a date picker and it enters that on the back end. But all of it's doing, it's not running its own database or anything like that. All it's doing is basically taking what you do in the UI and saving it as a file using regular Git commands inside of a repository. And so like if your site's hosted on GitHub, it uses the GitHub API. If it's on GitLab, it uses the GitLab API. Wherever your code is stored, it connects with that. And if you save it as a draft, it makes a pull request, which was one of the little magical things that I thought was really cool because it's like, oh, that totally makes sense. And one of the things that I think is cool about it, though, is that at any point along the way, if you're working with someone who prefers to work in Git or wants to look at that diff in the GitHub view or wants to like manage their the pull request by merging it inside of GitHub, they can. So you're not locked into the CMS for all of that stuff. You can actually go back and forth between them.
And I love it. I have two projects. Well, one is, so I helped my wife set up a website in Jekyll over Christmas, and she uses Nullify CMS without even knowing that she's using Jekyll, which is good. I have a virtual assistant who helps me with a lot of admin stuff, and one of those things is adding events and things to my website. And again, they use Nullify CMS without even realizing what they're doing. And it works really, really well. You get a few minor things you have to configure to begin with.
Yeah.
Once you're over those hiccups, and images as well, which is always everyone's favorite problem with CMSs and things.
Yeah. And we're adding some really cool things for that pretty soon, but I can't say any more about that. Just have to watch for it.
Project. What do you mean you can't say?
well, it's a Netlify service that's getting added that will tie into the open source thing. But you won't have to wait too long. Not too far
actually, I mean, so this is actually a question I wouldn't mind going at a slight tangent, but it sort of has come up. I mean, so Netlify is one of these companies, and we're not being paid to bring you on here.
No.
I just want to caveat that.
I'm not doing a paid presentation.
Netlify is one of those companies that is quite very good to open source projects in terms of
supporting them,
giving away a lot. I mean, I don't know. I've never paid for Netlify, and I've never found a need to, because all my projects are open source. But you're a venture capital backed company. You have to make revenue at some point. So how do you sort of offset this balancing act, or how does the company offset this balancing act of the fairly significant open source contributions in many ways with running a business? And of course, feel free to go to as much detail as you feel comfortable with this.
Well, I think there's a couple things about that. So one of them is Netlify CMS itself, which when I wasn't there yet, created Netlify CMS, it wasn't for the purpose of creating a CMS that we were going to start selling, but it was because there was a need in the space that, in this whole ecosystem of static site generators and working in the Jamstack, that was a gap of having an open source Git-backed CMS. And by making something like that, it makes the space more viable. And by making the space bigger and more viable, that means we have more customers, because that's the space we need them to be in to use Netlify. And so we have 2 full-time engineers on that, but our focus there is not to use Netlify CMS as a profit driver specifically, but to make that space more viable as a whole. And then in terms of, on the other side of things, you talked about open source projects being free, and you can actually put even private repositories on Netlify for free, but you can't get free teams. So, and there are a lot of open source projects that have special free accounts, and actually, that ends up being a lot of publicity and a nice selling point for us. That React and Kubernetes and Docker and Vue and all sorts of open source projects I can't even remember to name off are all have their docs on Nullify, and that means that more people can see it, and then that also means that I was talking to a company that might be using Nullify for their docs, and then they're like, "Well, can you tell me about other people who are using it?" And I said, "Well, and I just named off a bunch of open source projects, and they're like, "Oh, the React docs are on Nullify," and I was like, yeah. So I mean, that is actually an effective part of advertising, and that's how we think of it in our budget. We don't do a lot of paid advertising, and the entire cost of our free plans, like the entire cost of running any of our free sites, is actually counted in our marketing budget and not in like our operations budget, because that's kind of the purpose of it. That's where people get into it, and then we can then say, oh, I might be able to use this at work, and that sort of thing.
What a fantastic way to spend marketing dollars, rather than trying ads on billboards, actually making a difference. That's brilliant.
No 20 course sushi meals, just free web.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that gets made possible by venture backing, but
and actually, this is interesting because some of the features too that you've added over the years, the handful of years, I guess start to sort of flush out some of that. I don't know. I mean, a lot of the features I've never widely used. It doesn't mean I couldn't on a free plan. But I think another balancing act. So things like form submissions, authentication for the Nullify CMS as well as the front ends, A/B testing, like the preview branches you mentioned, the the serverless thing,
serverless functions, which is like super cool and powerful, but it takes a little while to understand what you
for sure. But they all start to add to the potential complexity. And again, how is that balancing act kind of weighed up of creating a service that kind of strips away a lot of those complexities of a CMS, but adding on features that are sort of from CMS land without it getting too complex?
Yeah. I mean, I guess part of it is that you only need to take what you need, as opposed to when you get a CMS, you sort of get the whole kit and caboodle all at once very often. And one of the things that I just totally lost my train of thought on that. With the I just completely. So thinking about the different things that are adding complexity. Yes. So the Jamstack as a whole, there we are, got right back onto it, is kind of complex. I mean, one of the things that's nice about the Jamstack and this concept of having your front end that's quite powerful because it can connect to all of these different APIs and you don't have to put it all into one server is really great and powerful. And you can, use a service that specializes in authentication to do the authentication. And you can use a service that specializes in payment processing to do that. And then you don't have to, worry about being good at all of the things. But it's also extremely overwhelming because there's just so many choices out there and so many options. And then you've got to, create a login at a new place and, all these different API keys you have to connect together. And so part of our goal is to sort of make it easier to tie all that together, because part of that way of developing as a whole gets sort of complex. And our goal is to be that spot in the middle where it makes it easy for you to tie those things together. And some of that's with our own services. Some of that very, very soon is going to be with partner services as well that are more easily integrated into your site directly from our UI. And so I think that's kind of where it comes in, that because having the option to add things as you need means that you can just make your stuff really simple. I mean, you can make a plain HTML site that's in a folder that you can drag onto the UI and it automatically gets published. Or you can have a really complex site that uses authentication and serverless functions to connect to a backend and all these sorts of things. And you can bite off the pieces as you're ready for them. And so I kind of like that about it.
Actually, just occurred It just occurred to me because I need to add authentication to a static site for one client, and I said, how are we going to do that? It just suddenly how I forgot that.
See, we're getting you.
Yeah.
All right. I think we have time for one more. I can see one lurking at the bottom of the doc that I know grabbed your interest earlier, Jared. So
let me have a look. Let me remind myself of what it was. Well, yes,
it's highlighted right now.
Right. So there's a thing going around at the moment, which is an interesting way of doing development, and that's a trend called documentation-driven development. I think it's sometimes called Readme-driven development as well. Now, I understand that you're actually doing that at Netlify as well. I'm just wondering if people haven't heard of this before, what does it actually mean?
And I think that'll vary somewhat in the implementation, but the basic concept is that before you start developing a feature, you write the docs for it. And that would be, to a degree, that's kind of just a spec. I mean, I've had people say like, well, isn't that just a spec? But you're more thinking about it from the user's perspective and taking the users through the steps of how you would do this. And there are a few different aspects of that. Some of it is just a matter of like, we've started doing this thing where we have a meeting. Well, someone works on it and then we like kind of talk about it to get consensus and make sure we've made sense for all the things. Is just determining the names for everything before we get started. Because a lot of times in the past, things have started to develop and then you're like, wait, that name's not going to make sense. We're going to need to call it this and it connects to this. And well, the role is going to be this, but when we talk about the capability, it's going to be this. And if that happens partway through the process, very often the name that's in the code is different from the name that's in the docs. And that can be a hassle for someone who's trying to work on that code. And so it's been really, really helpful for getting everybody on the same page before we even get started. And then also, because you're writing it as documentation, you're writing it as user-facing, like, this is how you would use this thing step by step. If you start going through those steps and you go, wait a minute, this is really hard. This is really hard to explain, or this is really hard to do. It's a really good time to be able to rethink what your planned implementation is before you're already invested in the code that's already been written. Because I know, I'm sure that you've been to projects where you're like, last in line and docs are getting written and you're like, this thing's really hard to explain because it's probably more complex than it needs to be, but it's too late to change. So I'm just going to have to kind of put together some instructions to make it work.
Write docs around the problem.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yes. So we're trying to, do the docs earlier, and then it has helped us spot things that we're like, you know what, now that if we do it this way, this is going to be way too much friction for someone who's trying to set it up. How can we make that easier? Or we'll find things that, if we call it this won't make sense over here. And I think it's still an adjustment and we're still kind of learning how it works into our process. But I think generally speaking, across the team, it's been really valuable, and it gets people on other teams more involved earlier on. So because we're writing customer-facing docs, our marketing team has a better idea of what's getting developed. Our support team has a better idea of how this is going to work. They can look through it and say like, well, we've got customers that are doing XYZ. That's not going to work with that. And we're knowing all of that earlier in the process, which helps just make everything more coordinated by the time we get to release. So it's been good.
That sounds like you'd be saving potentially a lot of money in development costs, writing or producing the wrong thing because it doesn't actually meet customer needs. And the only way that you would find that out traditionally, if you didn't do documentation-driven development, was when the docs were published. In a lot of cases. So it's definitely a docs or it didn't happen. Not so much that, but it's more docs or it probably
won't happen.
Yeah, or it won't happen. Yeah, that's
docs or it shouldn't happen. I don't know.
It shouldn't happen. I think that either one of those ones apply.
Have you tried this idea, Jared? I mean, I think I would love to try this on some of the teams I work on, but convincing people will be difficult.
We've tried. We do the whole implementation plan thing a fair bit at Credit Sense, and it's certainly even for docs. Like it's essentially my documentation plan is what I do when I do the implementation plan. It's great because even just doing that I've had situations where I was going down a particular path with what I was doing, particularly when I was doing all the shortlisting of technology and doing the corporate doc strategy there. And if I hadn't actually had that plan up front and had that communicated with my product owner, I would have gone down the wrong path for sure. So having that docs to start a conversation at least is, I think is actually paramount to software development or anything, really. Because it will get you out of trouble really early instead of waiting until it's cost you like $500,000.
On those words, on those immortal words of documentation save you money. Let's
let's go with that.
Let's wrap up this episode. So actually, firstly, we started talking about it, and then we didn't really finish it. Tom is flying somewhere. He's here because he's flying somewhere. He's not. No, he's coming back. It's fine. It's okay.
Couldn't do this from a plane.
He has left.
He's in the air somewhere.
That's right.
So yeah, thanks again to Jessica at Netlify. Very, very thorough on the Write the Doc Slack, and Twitter as well. I think if that
yes. Basically anywhere, GitHub, Twitter, all of them. If you look for very thorough, that's me.
Okay.
Or very thorough, depending on where
you're you could find previous episodes. Hello. You can find previous episodes of the show at podcast.writethedocs.org. And alongside there, you'll also find more information on Jared and myself and Tom, as well as past hosts. We did used to have a past host and past guests. Please go to there. And there's a contact form or the podcast channel on the Write the Doc Slack to suggest topics and speakers. We're fresh into a new year, so plenty of time to get some new ones in. If you haven't already, submit your submissions to the call for papers for the Portland conference. And has anybody got anything else they want to quickly plug, spruik, promote? No.
No, not me.
I think the only other thing I might, especially for our American listeners, is, as people may or may not know, I've been doing a lot of documentation work recently in the Ethereum space, which is a challenge and fascinating, but the community is recognizing it. And upcoming at Denver in when is it? In, I don't know, not long away, 2 weeks, I think. We're actually having a whole bunch of, I've managed to convince the fairly large event to have a whole bunch of pop-out tracks on developer experience and documentation in that space. So if you are involved in that space and are happen to be there, then drop me a line, because we're running a series of workshops in that space. We'd love to get people interested in those topics together. So if those two worlds merge as much as they do with me, then come and join us there. But in the meantime, he's already given us one bombshell. Give us another one, Jared. The time-honored tradition.
Docs. Or it didn't happen.